On August 20th, 1989, José and Kitty Menendez were shot to death inside their Beverly Hills home. Minutes later, their sons, Lyle and Erik, dialed 911, insisting someone else had done it. For a moment, even detectives had to admit it could be anyone. In the first hours, the answers didn't live in the rooms of that house. They lived in the stories people told outside it. José Menendez was a powerful entertainment executive, and the brothers pointed investigators toward the idea of a mob or business-related hit. It was an explanation that sounded like it belonged to the world José moved in, and that's exactly why it was dangerous. It could steer everything. Lyle was 21, Erik was 18. They were the ones who reported the killings, the ones police questioned first, the ones neighbors and friends watched for signs of grief, or something else. Investigators worked outward, hunting for enemies, debts, threats. But every hour that passed raised the same quiet pressure. If the killers were strangers, why did the facts refuse to settle into a clean, outside narrative? The case would soon become a national obsession, but the turning point wouldn't begin with a new witness at the gate or a break in the neighborhood. It would begin behind a closed door in a therapist's office where a private confession would be recorded. Words that, once they surfaced, would make the intruder story start to collapse. But the confession didn't reach police by accident, and the person who carried it in would change everything. In the days after the shootings, detectives chased the most obvious shadow: José Menendez's world. He'd been running a film studio's home video division, and investigators initially looked at whether the killings were tied to his business. Someone outside the house, someone angry enough to send a message. And the brothers fed that direction. They told police they'd come home to find their parents dead, and they pointed away from themselves. But weeks turned into months, and the case didn't behave like a clean outside hit. The answers weren't arriving at the station, yet the spotlight kept drifting back to the two young men who lived in the center of it. What drew that spotlight wasn't a fingerprint or a witness, it was behavior. In the wake of the murders, Lyle and Erik appeared to be spending their parents' money: Rolex watches, real estate, investments in businesses, big moves that were easy to notice and impossible for detectives to ignore. Suspicion is not evidence, but it changes how every interview sounds, how every alibi is weighed. Then came the private room where secrets tend to surface: therapy. Court records show Beverly Hills police would soon be seeking audio tape recordings connected to sessions with psychologist Jerome Oziel tied to the killings. About 6 months after the murders, Judalon Smith, described as Oziel's girlfriend, went to police and said the brothers had confessed in therapy and that a recording existed. If she was telling the truth, what did the tape capture when the Menendez brothers believed the room was safe? In early March 1990, the case stopped being a rumor and became paper, warrants, seals, and a clock that suddenly started ticking. A Beverly Hills magistrate authorized a search of psychologist Jerome Oziel's office and home for recordings tied to the Menendez killings. The next day, officers arrived with a special master, an added safeguard, because what they were seeking could be legally radioactive. Inside Oziel's files were tapes, not just recollections, but recorded material connected to sessions dated October 31st and November 2nd, 1989. Then another on November 28th, and a joint session recorded on December 11th. Oziel asserted therapist-patient privilege on the brothers' behalf, and the seized tapes were sealed for court review. That seal mattered. It meant prosecutors didn't simply get a confession, they had to earn the right to use it. Days later, on March 12, 1990, the Los Angeles County District Attorney filed a felony complaint charging Lyle and Erik with murder, along with special circumstance allegations that signaled prosecutors were seeking the harshest outcomes available. From the outside, it looked like a clean pivot. The sons who made the 911 call were now the defendants. But inside the courthouse, the real fight was just beginning. Over the summer, hearings unfolded over what could be heard and what must remain private. The state argued exceptions. The defense argued confidentiality. When the issue reached California's highest court, the ruling didn't simply open the door. It drew a line, allowing only part of what Oziel recorded to be used and sealing the rest. With the confession now fractured by law, what evidence could still carry this case to trial? 2 days before the killings, prosecutors later pointed to a trip that didn't fit the outside intruder story. On August 18, 1989, court records say Erik and Lyle Menendez bought 2 Mossberg shotguns at a Big 5 sporting goods store in San Diego, $200 each, and used a California driver's license in the name Donovan J. Goodrow, along with a non-existent address. A purchase like that leaves a trail, even when names are borrowed. Then came the night of August 20th. The same record describes a 911 dispatcher receiving a call at 11:47 p.m. The caller, identified as Lyle, said, "Someone killed my parents." Officers arrived, and the brothers ran out toward them, screaming. In interviews, after the bodies were removed, the brothers said they'd been elsewhere when it happened, and Lyle raised the idea that the killings might be business-related. The implication was clear. Look outward, not inward. But investigators kept hearing a second version of the same: deflection. In later proceedings, courts summarized evidence that the brothers told others the murders could be connected to the mafia or to José Menendez's business conflicts, an explanation they would later abandon. Suspicion hardened into a case built on planning, story shifts, and what prosecutors argued was an attempt to make the guns untraceable. By March 1990, both brothers were under arrest for first-degree murder. 3 years after that, in July 1993, they went to trial. Separate juries, televised, where prosecutors argued money, and the defense admitted the shootings but claimed fear and self-defense. If the jury accepted that admission, the only question left was whether the brothers were confessing to murder or to something they said they had survived. By July 1993, the Menendez case wasn't just a file. It was a televised courtroom spectacle, split into 2 trials running side by side, with a separate jury for each brother. The prosecution's theory was blunt. The killings were planned, and money was the motive. The defense didn't contest the central act. Lyle and Erik had shot their parents, but argued something far more volatile: that they believed they were in danger. After years of emotional and sexual abuse, they said came from their father, and that fear drove what happened next. That meant the trial wasn't only about what happened on August 20th, 1989. It became a fight over who José and Kitty Menendez were inside their own home. 2 radically different portraits, both aiming to explain the same gunshots. Every witness, every family detail, every prior statement became a pressure point. If the abuse claims were believed, intent could look different. If jurors doubted them, the spending, the shifting stories, and the planning allegations could take center stage. Then the juries disappeared into deliberations, and the country waited for a clean verdict that never arrived. In January 1994, Erik's jury reported it was deadlocked, and Judge Stanley Weisberg declared a mistrial. 2 weeks later, Lyle's jury also remained split, and Weisberg declared a second mistrial. With no verdict and everything on the line, prosecutors chose to try the brothers again. But the next time, the courtroom rules were about to get tighter, and the defense story would face new limits. After the mistrials, both sides came back with a different kind of weapon: control. The second time, the courtroom would be tighter, quieter, and less forgiving. Judge Stanley Weisberg ordered the brothers retried together before a single jury, and cameras were kept out, no split verdicts, no competing juries, no televised chaos to dilute the impact of a single narrative. That shift mattered because the case now depended on what the jury was allowed to hear. Prosecutors, led in the retrial by David Kahn, pushed a straightforward story: planning, deception, and an inheritance-sized reason to lie. The defense still admitted the shootings, but the emotional core of their argument, fear rooted in alleged abuse, faced stricter limits. The brothers weren't just fighting the state. They were fighting the boundaries of their own explanation, forced to compress years of claims into what a judge ruled relevant and admissible. And that compression created a dangerous vacuum. When jurors hear less context, they fill the silence with what remains: the gun purchases, the changing stories, the money spent afterward, the taped words that prosecutors said revealed intent instead of panic. Each piece didn't need to prove everything, only enough to make the self-defense claim feel like a story written after the fact. Comment blank if you believe in justice and awareness. By the time the retrial settled into its rhythm, the question wasn't whether Lyle and Erik killed their parents. They'd already said they did. The question was whether the law would let the jury truly weigh why. With the defense boxed in and the stakes unchanged, would one jury still hear fear or only planning? When the retrial opened on August 23, 1995, the atmosphere was different on purpose. One courtroom, one jury, no television cameras. The brothers weren't performing for two separate panels anymore. Every argument would land on the same set of ears and stick. Prosecutors came in with a tactical goal: make the story smaller and harder to escape. Instead of relitigating every claim from the first trial, they pressed the jury toward a single, unflinching question: premeditated murder or not? And as the retrial unfolded, the defense's ability to present its most emotionally powerful themes was blunted by courtroom rulings the defense later called devastating. That narrowing changed the weight of what remained. The brothers had admitted the shootings, so jurors were not deciding who pulled the trigger. They were being asked to decide why, and whether why legally mattered. Every time the defense tried to widen the frame, prosecutors pulled it back to planning, purchase, trails, and the argument that the abuse narrative was either exaggerated or constructed after the fact. On March 20, 1996, after deliberations, the jury convicted both Lyle and Erik Menendez of first-degree murder. Reports from the time also described convictions for conspiracy, with special circumstance findings that exposed them to the most severe punishment. And then, with guilty finally spoken out loud, the case pivoted into its final, colder question: would the state take their lives or keep them forever? On July 2, 1996, the case that had sprawled across years of testimony and two trials collapsed into a single courtroom moment. Judge Stanley Weisberg sentenced Lyle and Erik Menendez to life without the possibility of parole for the murders of their parents, José and Kitty. The legal language was cold, but it carried a specific weight. Their convictions included first-degree murder with special circumstances, multiple murders and lying in wait, findings that had exposed them to the possibility of a death sentence. Instead, the punishment was permanence: 2 consecutive life terms, a future measured not in years but in never. In true crime, sentence often sounds like an ending, but for the Menendez brothers, it also became a kind of separation order. Within months, they would no longer share the same air, the same routines, or even the same chance to speak freely. Reporting years later, ABC News described September 10, 1996, as the last time the brothers saw each other for more than 2 decades. And while the public moved on to the next headline, the case hardened into a quieter life. Legal filings, prison transfers, and a story that, on paper, looked finished. Then, decades later, officials confirmed the brothers were reunited in the same California prison housing unit. If the courts had already decided their fate, what could possibly reopen a case that was built to stay closed forever? For decades, the Menendez story felt sealed by two words: without parole. Then, in May 2023, their lawyers filed a habeas petition arguing that the jury never heard evidence they say would have mattered, pointing to a letter Erik purportedly wrote before the murders describing abuse, and to a former member of the band, Menudo, who later alleged José Menendez sexually abused him as a teenager. A year later, the political winds shifted into court filings. On October 24, 2024, then Los Angeles County District Attorney George Gascon announced he would recommend resentencing, citing the brothers' age at the time of the crime and decades of prison rehabilitation. A new district attorney, Nathan Hoshman, took office and opposed that move, arguing the brothers had not fully accepted responsibility and asking the court to withdraw the request. But the court didn't close the door. Governor Gavin Newsom ordered a comprehensive risk assessment through the state parole board as part of the clemency review process. And on May 13, 2025, Judge Michael Jasek reduced both sentences from life without parole to 50 years to life, making them immediately eligible to seek parole. For the first time since 1996, freedom wasn't just a theory. It had a date on a calendar. In August 2025, the parole board denied parole for both brothers, and in September 2025, a judge rejected their habeas bid for a new trial, leaving clemency as the remaining gate that could still change everything. If the parole board and the courts both said no, would the governor say yes? On May 13, 2025, nearly 36 years after José and Kitty Menendez were killed, Judge Michael Jasek cut Lyle and Erik Menendez's punishment from life without parole to 50 years to life. It didn't set them free. It simply reopened a door the system had bolted shut in 1996, a chance to ask the state to look at them again. The answer came fast. In August 2025, California parole commissioners heard each brother in separate marathon hearings and denied parole to both, ordering a 3-year wait before they could try again. The denials leaned heavily on prison misconduct and the board's conclusion that even after decades, the risk to public safety was not low enough to ignore. 1 month later, another path collapsed. On September 15, 2025, a Los Angeles Superior Court judge rejected their habeas petition seeking a new trial based on what their attorneys called newly discovered evidence tied to abuse allegations. The ruling didn't erase the debate that still follows this case, but it did keep the convictions in place. As March 2026 begins, the brothers remain incarcerated in San Diego, with the next parole window years away. Their clemency request to Governor Gavin Newsom, who previously ordered a state risk assessment, still hangs over the story like an unanswered appeal. And that may be the final truth of the Menendez case. In America, a family can die in one night, but the arguments about why can last a lifetime.